So don't believe the myth that Christianity is lazy, unscientific thinking. The Christian story is eminently pro-science, as modern science grew out of Christian soil. There is a common assumption by some doubters and believers that there is a zero-sum war between the Christian concept of creation and Darwin's theory of biological evolution. That to be a Christian, to believe what the Bible teaches in Genesis, requires you to stand at odds with the mainstream scientific consensus. So what does the Christian story say about the origin of our species? Should Christians reject evolution? Well, this is a subject that can spark strong reactions. So let me sketch out a few things by way of response that I hope will help you make your own mind up on this question, busting a few myths along the way about Christians being anti-intellectual or about science being anti-God. Perhaps the first thing to recognize is that Christianity is pro-science. Since all truth is God's truth, there is an ancient tenet in Christian thinking, exemplified in the language of the scientist Francis Bacon, that God speaks to us through two great books: the book of God's works in creation and the book of God's words in Scripture. Both serve as divine revelation, and we need to study both to illuminate the whole truth about reality. Which is precisely the theological rationale that the scientific revolutionaries gave for their own study of nature, from Galileo Galilei to Isaac Newton to Johannes Kepler. These men loved God, they believed the Bible, and were so driven by the language of Genesis that they sought to study God's world in order to discover the truth about how God governs creation, and for the purposes of showcasing God's glory in harnessing nature to serve human enterprise, with a lens towards the holistic flourishing of all creation. So don't believe the myth that Christianity is lazy, unscientific thinking. The Christian story is eminently pro-science, as modern science grew out of Christian soil. But as is always the case, whether in nature or Scripture, divine revelation, it requires human interpretation. And the simple truth is, Christians who love Jesus, believe the Bible, and care about the truth, they don't all agree on how to interpret Genesis or how to read God's two books together. Which leads to a second response to this question. Christians have options. Unlike those who are restricted purely to naturalistic explanations for the origins and biological diversity on Earth, with God's special intervention on the table, Christians have a broader range of live options, meaning they don't have to shoehorn either nature or Scripture to awkwardly fit the other. Long before the scientific revolution or the famed treatise of Charles Darwin, the early church fathers offered a range of interpretations of the creation accounts in Genesis, trying to faithfully interpret the complex genre of these early chapters. Is it a scientific account of nature's origins, or an epic myth, or a rich theological account of God's purposes? Well, no one knows for sure. And even if we read it as literal history, is there a gap between the initial moment of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and then the days of creation which follow? Or perhaps a gap between the creation days themselves? Or given the way the word day is used in 5 different ways in the first 2 chapters of Genesis alone, should we interpret these days as epochs of history rather than as 24-hour periods? These questions lead to a spectrum of options, where Christians way more intelligent than I am, trained in both science and Scripture, argue for different positions. From young earth creationism, where God spoke everything into being some 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, to evolutionary creation on the other end of the spectrum, where God guides evolutionary processes to create all that is, following the common scientific accounts over a process of billions of years. And there are countless positions filling in the spaces between these two alternatives. There are even novel positions developed in the past few years that seek to reconcile both God's special creation of Adam and Eve in the more recent history with an evolutionary account of Homo sapiens. So there is no shortage of live options, which means this is an in-house disagreement amongst Christians. You can be a Christian and believe in evolution, because some of the godliest and wisest Christians I know do so. You can also be a Christian and reject evolution if through your study you become convinced it doesn't stack up as an explanation. And there are some serious critiques of evolution as a total explanation from both secular voices and Christian ones. Whether it's evolution's inability to explain the rise of life from non-life, abiogenesis, or consciousness from non-consciousness, this singularity. Serious thinkers like Thomas Nagel have rejected a Darwinian explanation as simply inadequate for the rich complexity of everything that we see. And from a Christian perspective, you have to grapple with whether you think the brutality of evolution is a means of creation befitting God's character, or whether you can reconcile the reality of death prior to any human fall with the rest of the gospel in the Christian story. These aren't trivial challenges, which leads to a third response. Don't be too hasty answering controversial questions. There is a real temptation to try and sign up to someone else's beliefs simply for the sake of being accepted, to fit in, whether in a secular or religious community. But that impulse should be resisted. My theology prof in Oxford gave me some really wise advice. He said, whenever you come across doctrinal debates where Christians, in good standing to the gospel, disagree, well, you should give yourself some serious time. He suggested 7 years to engage with the best voices on either side. Read the best arguments on each position, wrestle with these questions in community, and ask away at these explanations to see which one stacks up best. And along the way, pray that God would help you to form a faithful and a humble theological perspective. You know what? It seems like good advice. And if you're interested in somewhere to start wrestling with the back and forth on these arguments, why not pick up a book from Zondervan, like the 3 views on creation evolution, or 4 views on the historical Adam, or 3 views on the book of Genesis, as a helpful starting point. Ultimately, it seems to me a Christian is not bound in this question, but it's a tremendous freedom to explore the options, to evaluate freely the evidence, and to form their own theological perspective on how to reconcile God's 2 books, only to then hold our views with humility and generosity of spirit. As the old aphorism goes, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity.
Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.